everybody another 30 seconds to get here, and then we'll get started. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I am Nick Chase from Mirantis, and we are here with today's webinar, Getting Started with Kubernetes, Part 1, Introduction to YAML. Let me just tell you a little bit about me, not much, because I know you don't care. You are only here for the content, and that is cool. I am in charge of technical marketing and developer relations here at Mirantis. So if you have any questions you want to send my way, you feel free to do that. I am at nchase@mirantis.com, or you can get me at Nick Chase on Twitter. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping before we start. This is actually not what you will see on the screen because I didn't realize we were using BrightTalk this morning. But there is somewhere in your interface a way to ask questions. Please go ahead and submit them. We will hold all the questions for the end, and then we will answer them all in a block. Also, you will get a link where you can download the slides, or you can just come back to the BrightTalk webinar. So you don't have to frantically take notes, but you might want to because, it's YAML, and, YAML is so cool. Anyway, sorry, I've been watching way too much Big Bang Theory. Anyway, so who is this for? It would be good if you have a basic understanding of Kubernetes, but for this webinar, we're actually not going to talk about Kubernetes itself. We're just going to talk about the YAML format. So we're in part 2, we'll talk about how we build the basic building blocks of Kubernetes. But right now, we're just talking about the actual basics of how to create the YAML itself. All right, so there are different uses for YAML. You can see there are things like configurations, such as Kubernetes or Swarm, or lots of things like OpenStack templates, Ansible, Maven. You see it all over the place. We are going to cover that as we go through. So we'll talk about the different uses. We'll talk about the overall structure. There are actually data types, even though this is all, text. And then we will look at some of the tools that are available for you. All right, so let's look at the different uses for YAML. As I said before, configurations, templates, and so on. So for example, in Kubernetes, we use YAML for defining things like pods. So a pod is a unit of workload that Kubernetes orchestrates. Okay, Swarm, you could see here, totally different, even though they are both talking about orchestrating containers. So this is OpenStack. You'll notice they're all doing different things, but what you're seeing is a format, okay? And that format basically takes care of what makes it YAML. So you've got your text, You've got indentations or not indentations, depending on the situation. But you'll notice there's no common vocabulary. And that is important to understand because YAML is not a quote unquote language in that you have to learn all the keywords and everything like that. It's a type of markup language, although technically speaking, YAML stands for YAML ain't markup language, but you know, or yet another markup language. It depends who you ask. So there's no specific vocabulary. It's based on the formatting and it's made to be predictable. All right, so let's look at overall YAML structure to start out with. Okay, we've got a very simple YAML document would be something like these associative arrays. Okay, now you've dealt with this in all kinds of other languages. You've got a key and a value, a name and the data that goes with it. So this is kind of the simplest YAML document that you can have. All right, so these associative arrays we can put all over other documents. Now, here's the interesting thing that we have to make note of. This is our traditional YAML format, but YAML is actually a superset of JSON. So if it's valid JSON, it's valid YAML. All right. So for example, if I wanted to write this YAML document as JSON, I could do that. And this format you're familiar with. Okay, you've seen this. You've seen this 1,000 times. It's the same thing. All right. Now, a couple things to note here. See how there's a colon here, and we have not put this in quotes? That's why you must put a space after the colon in your associative arrays. Okay. If it was JSON, it wouldn't matter because you got your quotes setting everything off, but that's the price you pay for simplicity. Okay, now, another thing that we can do is nested values. So for example, as the value of the metadata is another associative array. And in that case, that would be name is pod example. So the way that we associate this array with this name is to indent it. Okay. Now, like with other indent dependent languages, you need to make sure that you are consistent. Okay. So if you're going to use 2 spaces, that's fine. If you're going to use 4 spaces, that's fine. But you must be consistent. So you have the, so now the other thing is make sure that you never, ever, ever use tabs instead of spaces. You must use spaces. So in this case, you can see that we are indenting using 2 spaces. And we've got 2 objects that have, nested values. And pardon my door here. And notice that there are multiple items here that are all part of spec. And since they're all indented, we know what they all are. Okay. And our format got a little screwy on this one. So let me just get out of this because this is not what it should be. Do this properly for you. So we have a sequence and we want to list it. And of course, we're going to have to deal with our formatting, but you'll get the idea. And I'll show you the difference between these two in a second. So in this case, we have 4 items, each of which, I'm sorry, 5 items, each of which is an item of SEO metadata. Okay, so these are 5 SEO metadata items. But if we go back here, this is one spec with 4 parameters. Okay. Now, just make sure, take a look at that, make sure that you got it. These hyphens are the important part there. All right. Now, you can put multiple objects in a single YAML document. And the way that you do that is by separating them with these 3 dashes. Okay, so here I have 2 different objects. They happen to be the same, but there are 2 objects in this document. All right. Another thing for the basic format that we need to know is how do you put in comments? This one has a lot of comments in it. They are all preceded by the hashtag, okay, the hash symbol, or #, depending on where you are and what you like to call it. Okay, so you can see here's a comment, here's a comment. These are comments, and here we can also see some of the flexibility. So as you can see here, we have, let's kind of work our way through this to see how all of this structure manifested itself. All right, so we have metadata. We have one item of metadata with a comment, okay? And then the spec consists of a template, which consists of another spec, which consists of one or more containers. And those containers are set off by this hyphen. So if we were going to put another container in here, it would be down here at the same level with another hyphen, okay? The definition of this container has multiple values, all right, including command arguments. So here you can see we've got an argument that's set off by the hyphen. It also has a hyphen, but it doesn't matter because we've got that space in there, so that's fine. And we're going to talk a little bit about this this format in a few minutes. All right, so hopefully that was all clear. If you have any questions, put them into the question box, and we will get to them at the end. Okay, so next, data types. Now, yeah, that's all text, which is fine, no problem. The problem is that, well, it's not really a problem. And the opportunity is that these YAML files are typically used by other software to do things, you know, to configure your Kubernetes or to install your application or to define your OpenStack heat stack, whatever. Okay, and as such, there are going to be times when the type of the data does actually matter. Is that a string? Is it an integer? Is it a hex value? And YAML actually does define those things so that you can get them out of your, you know, so that your software can get at them. So there are built-in data types. Strings, obviously, we are, you know, That's the basics. I'd be really worried if you couldn't do a string. Map and dictionary, that is essentially our associative arrays that we were talking about earlier. Integers, floats, booleans. Base 64, you can put in binary data. Lists, sets, those are sequences. We talked about those. You can do timestamps and hex values. Now, here's the thing that you have to understand. The YAML specification defines all these things, which is great. That's terrific. But not every YAML parser is going to support all of these types. Okay, so for example, I'm going to use PyYAML in this, and I'll show you how we're going to build that script in a second. But PyYAML, at least the version of PyYAML that I have, doesn't support base 64 directly. Okay, so the main thing is you have to understand what does your parser support and deal with it appropriately. So for example, if I wanted to use base 64, I would have to have it in there as a string and then manipulate it through my Python script. Okay, so let's take a quick look at how we would actually read a YAML file. So if I were going to install PyYAML, because I use Python, that's just sort of my go-to language. You don't have to. There are, as we'll see later, there are libraries for YAML in, I cannot think of a language that doesn't have a library for YAML. So, but in this example, I'm just going to do pip install PyYAML, and then I've got my script. And actually, I'm going to go to my script itself. Ooh, let's do that. All right, so if I come over here, just clear this. So if I come over here, what you can see is I'm importing YAML itself. And then I am going with, I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bigger so you can actually see it. There we go. All right, so I'm going to open the file just as you normally would. And I'm going to use the YAML package to load all of the documents in there. So remember, we said that we can separate them with those 3 dashes. And then we're going to run through each one. And for each one, in my case, I know that I'm going to have just associative arrays. So I want to print out the name and the value. So I'm going to grab those. I'm going to get the name, the type of the value, and then the value itself. So let's take a look. Let's actually do this. Okay, so if I were to come in here, and I'm going to grab, we got to get it out of percent mode. So you get to see behind the curtain here, no present modes. So if I were to grab all of these, let's take a look at them. We're going to put them in a file. And this is the wrong file. Okay, put them here. So I'm going to save this and actually point this at the correct file. So let's look at these. So I have a bunch of, my slides are completely out of order. And I apologize to you for that. This is the slide that I want. In case you think that you're having a rough day, okay, if this is the worst that my day gets, I'm in good shape. So let's start with this. So we're used to the lists. We saw these sequences. All right. Now, let's see. So we have, if we just take the expression 1, all right, we can express it as a string, an integer, a float, a dictionary. Now notice, I'm not really doing anything different here. I didn't put this in quotes. I didn't do anything different. So will YAML be able to tell the difference between an integer and a float based on just what's there? So let's see. So if I come over here to our script and I run it, oh, see, this is how you know it's live, folks. Helps if you save the file. Let's run it again. All right, so we got, this is a list. All right, it noticed that it was a list, and it knew that it was this array of 2 items. So 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay. It recognized the string, it recognized the integer, it recognized the float because we had the decimal point and the following values, and it recognized the dictionary. Okay. Notice that it's here in JSON format in both of these cases. That's because we have transferred this over to the conceptual level as to what is this data now, as opposed to the string. Okay, so let's look at our next set. If I come back here, these are also scalar values. So all of these we're talking about, well, most of them we're talking about are scalar values. And let's come back and look at these. So hex value, again, this is a string, or is it a number? Octal values. Well, let's see what we get on these. Okay, let's run the script. Let's clear this first. Run the script. All right. Again, this is how you know it's live. All right. There we go. Now, so let's look back at our data. All right. Now, hex comes out as an integer, okay, in this parser. The type is noted as an integer, but you'll notice that the value is not 0x4824. That little 0x at the beginning was the cue to the YAML parser that we're talking about, a hexadecimal value here. And what it's done is it's translated that into a base 10 integer. Okay. And it's done the same with the octal value, octal being base 8. For those of you who are far enough away from math class, our normal numbers are base 10. So it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then we go over to the next column. For octal, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we go over to the next column. So this is actually a value of 8. Okay, and YAML knew this because we preceded the number with a 0. Okay, so you need to make sure you understand these things, because if you just have a leading 0 in front of your integers and all of a sudden you're getting weird, crazy values, well, your YAML parser may think that you're dealing in base 8 with octal values. It does recognize dates. Now, remember, I showed you timestamp. Some parsers will recognize the actual timestamp value. This one does not. Boolean values. So you'll notice that all of these were recognized as Booleans. They're just strings, but they were recognized as Booleans. So on, off, true, false, yes, no, were all recognized as Booleans. Now, yes, no, be careful, because this depends on the version of YAML. So in YAML 1.1, yes, no is recognized as a Boolean. However, in YAML 1.2, it is not. It's just a string. So be careful. And of course, just putting your quotes around something is going to make it into a string, even if it normally would be recognized as something else. Okay. All right. So going back to our data types. Now, there are other ways that we can deal with data types, and that would be to sort of force what we want on them. Okay, so if I were to come in here and save the file this time, clear this. So I can go ahead and tell YAML specifically that I want to use this built-in type. So this is binary data, okay? And I want to force this to be a float. And this says I can try and force it to be an integer, but let's see what happens when we do all that, okay? So if I come back here, all right, so you'll notice now that our binary data has been translated, okay? Our float has been made into a float now, and also our integer, even though this was in quotes, was translated into an integer. But of course, if you had, 1A or the word one, so like if I put, 1, that obviously is not going to fly. Okay. So, all right. Let's go back. One more thing on how these work. This is not so much about data types, but remember I told you we were talking about these formats here. Okay. So a lot of times in YAML, you're going to have multi-line data. Now, when you have multi-line data, you're going to have to deal with it because obviously, you have to work with it. Now, there are two ways that YAML deals with multi-line data. So in this case, you notice I'm using a greater than sign. I want to take all of this text and I want it to be just one string. Now, notice I have indented it here, okay? Because it's YAML. This, if I were to put this out here, then it would be an error because YAML wouldn't know that it was part of this example. So let's look at the difference between the greater than sign and the pipe. All right, so if I were to come back here to types, first save this file and run it. All right, so let's take a look. So if I come back, what I see here is that our first string, my phone just died. All right, so our first string is going in with all, it's been put into a single line, okay? Even though it was on multiple lines. However, when I use the pipe, the pipe then goes ahead and it sets it up so that the formatting is preserved. All right. So you'll notice we have here, here's our string. Everything is preserved, including this blank line here. All right. So if you need to preserve your spaces within, if you need to preserve your lines within a block, you can use the pipe to do that. Now, notice all of this white space is gone. Okay, these are up against the left margin here, even though there's plenty of white space here, because technically speaking, as part of the data, that white space does not exist. Okay, that white space is solely to identify that that text is part of the message object. Now, all right, if you have questions on that, please go ahead and put them in the question pane, and we shall move right along. So one place that you see this come up a lot is in things like config maps for Kubernetes. So you can see an example of this where you've got different pieces of data specified by different names, and you're being very specific about what you want. Okay. Oh, quick note here. Notice you can put a dot in your value names. So your associative arrays can have that for your names. Okay. So what else have we got here? Another place that this comes up a lot is in passing secrets to Kubernetes. Again, we are using the base 64 type here. My parser doesn't recognize it, but the parser that's used by Kubernetes does. So that's where, again, it's important to know your parser, know what you are working with. Okay, so I'm going to go back into present mode here for a minute. All right, now tools. If you've ever sat down with just a plain text editor and tried to do something, you can do it. That's all YAML is. You can use whatever you want, Emacs, VI, whichever religious order you are part of, feel free. But there are definitely tools that are on the market that are there to kind of help you use YAML more easily. For example, I love the fact that there are so many open source objects. So as you can see here, plenty. All right, 208 YAML open source projects, and they're all different. They're all different things. Part of, you can do math. There's package managers. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong place. You can do format your code. You can do all kinds of things, but here are some of my favorites. Okay. I said earlier that I wasn't aware of a language that didn't have a YAML parser. So if you go to YAML.org, you will see tons and tons and tons and tons of options. Okay. So you can definitely go there, pick whatever you need from whatever language. There's test suites, there's different versions, and so on. There are tools that will allow you to easily work with your YAML. So for example, this is great because this is a whole collection, onlineYAMLtools.com. By the way, I don't work for any of these. I'm not being compensated. They're just fun things that I have found. So for example, if I were to take my data here, here obviously it's already color coded. And for example, I use VS Code. VS Code already understands YAML. because I have the YAML plugin. So it does that for me. But if I didn't, I could take it in here and it would color code it for me. Or I could use Minify. All right, so like Minify takes, what it does is it takes your YAML. Now remember, our spacing and our indents and all that, that's crucial to YAML. You can't really minify YAML itself, but you can turn it into its JSON version and minify that. Okay, so that is what we're doing here. And they have a bunch of tools there. There's JSONformatter.org has a ton of tools for converting, YAML to JSON, YAML to XML, vice versa. You can also convert them to a class. So for example, if I wanted to convert this to a class, here is my class definition in Python. Okay, and then I could then, set my data and so on. So this is something that I would then want to use when I was doing my programming. Okay, now let's look at some others that we have here. We looked at Minify. Looked at Minify a minute ago. There is a browser called Atom. I don't know if any of you've ever used it. It's a text editor. It's very popular and it has a YAML mode. I haven't used it, but I've heard a lot of good things about it, so I thought I would leave it on you there. All kinds of things like documentation. Oh, linting. Linting is one of my favorite things here. So a lot of times what will happen is you'll wind up with a complicated object. So for example, let me kind of go back here. So let's say I had this, I love technology. Let's say I have a fairly complicated, this is actually not that complicated, but let's say I have a complicated YAML object and it's not working for some reason and I can't figure out why. Okay. What I can do is run it through a YAML linter, and what that will do is it will find if there is an error. So in this case, there is an error. All right. So and it will clean it up to what it thinks you want. So be careful. All right. So in this case, there you go. So all right. Now, a couple of last things. We talked about converting to different languages, so I won't do that. And then one last thing, strict YAML. So there is a movement to create something that is a little less loosey-goosey and makes it more predictable. The good thing about having things flexible is they're easy to use. The bad thing about having things flexible is they can be really difficult to use. So in this case, you can check out strict YAML. And again, it all depends on your parser. What are you looking at? So in this case, you would use the strict YAML parser rather than the YAML parser we were looking at before. But it's just something to think about, not required for anything in particular. All right, so now let us, so if does anybody have any questions? Now is the time to put them in the question box and let us see what we can do to answer them. All right. This should say, thank you. Okay, so let us go back into view mode. And let's see. I understand we've been getting some questions, so my trusty producer, Erica, has been gathering them together. Let me look through them right now and see what we have. Okay, is there any kind of standardization, kind of an RFC against YAML? Yes, so we looked at that earlier. You may have seen this when we went to YAML.org. These are the kind of specifications for YAML. So you can go ahead and check those out specifically. See, YAML ain't markup language. It used to be yet another markup language, but I don't know who decided to change it, but they did. So there is a specification document. You can check that out. It is just as opaque as most specification documents. So there you go. Let's see. Next question. How many spaces need to be used for indentation? The answer is however many you want to, as long as you are consistent. So the nice thing there is if you have, when I was a kid, I'm going to really date myself now. But when I was a kid, I learned how to program in BASIC. And in BASIC, you number your lines. And they always told us to start off numbering your lines 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, you know, whatever. So that if we wanted to put something in the middle, we could do that without having to renumber everything. So we could put in a line, you know, 15, 16, 17. I try and do the same thing with my YAML, where I start out with like 4 or 6 spaces, even though it kind of gets a little bit wide. And the reason that I do that is that way, if I need to kind of insert a layer, I can do that without having to move everything. All right, now let's see here. And a dot in a value name means what again? Okay, so it doesn't mean anything. It's just that you can have one. It just becomes part of the string. So, and I'm assuming that this refers back to this here. So there's no special meaning for that period. It's just, I'm just pointing out that you can actually have them. Okay. Don't understand the difference between greater than and pipe. Can you please explain once again? Okay. Yeah. So let's go back up here. So let me actually go here. All right. So if I have, I'm going to say I have I've got 1, 2, 3 lines. Okay. And if I did the same thing over here, it's all in, excuse me, it's all in how this white space is treated. Okay. So if I were to run this, you'll notice that what I get from this is a continuous string, 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's turned these line feeds into single spaces. Whereas if I did the same with a pipe, it is going to honor those. It is going to honor those line feeds. In fact, another way that we can see this is if we take this and go back to the minify. Let's go back to minify. Let's just grab a tools, minify. So if we went here, so take a look at what we got here. So this was translated simply into 1 space 2 space 3, and then a line feed. Okay. Whereas this was translated into 1 line feed, 2 line feed, 3 line feed. Okay. I hope that clears it up for you, the difference between greater than and a pipe. All right, let's see. Next question. YAML works in all cloud providers. That was a question. YAML works wherever it was intended to work. So Kubernetes uses YAML. So anywhere that supports Kubernetes is going to support YAML to do that. If a cloud service is set up to parse YAML, then that's, then they'll do that. If they're not, then they won't. It's not that the cloud service itself uses YAML, it's what's within that cloud service. If that was not clear, please ask another question to clarify that. Why is YAML mostly used in configuration files and not that much in data exchange, like in REST API design where JSON excels more? Is JSON a better serialization for YAML? Okay, now first remember that JSON is YAML. Okay, it's a subset of YAML, but it is YAML. However, I do get the point of your question. Why don't we use this format for data transfer? Now we can, and some places do. In fact, Kubernetes, we'll see this in part 2. A lot of Kubernetes does use YAML as input and output. However, in general, the JSON format is easier to use and more convenient. So for example, and when I say more convenient, I don't know why I needed the Beatles for that, but okay. Because it's more compact, okay? And it's more forgiving. So if I were to have, if I were to format this JSON as, let me take this back into our other file so you can see what I'm doing. If I were to do that, and then I did say that, okay, that's still perfectly valid. So if I were to run it, it's not going to give us an error. Everything is correct, even though this is not valid YAML format, okay, other than the fact that it is JSON. All right, next question. Goodness, there's so many questions here. Okay, does the pipe add /n to the output? Yes, it does. We saw that. Any recommendation on the best YAML editor to assist on the column alignment, which is necessary for syntax checking? Again, it's really up to you. Chances are your favorite editor is going to support it. Like I said, I use VS Code because it's convenient and it's free and it's available. And it does have a YAML. It does have a YAML plugin, so we're good there. But there's no particular one that's better than any other. Can you explain again the octal transformation and the need to start with 0? All right, so this is something that is not going to come up for most people. Okay, octal is a base 8 numbering system. All right, it's not used in most cases. So octal would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay. It's not going to hit most of you. You don't need to worry about it. I'm just pointing that out because that 0 is the cue to the YAML parser that this is an octal number. So if you do that without intending to do it, you could wind up with something very strange on the value side. I'm being asked to remind everyone that you will get the slides later, and you can watch this on demand, so you can always come back and watch it again. All right. How would you prefer to store YAML in a database like blob or clob or as relations? Oh boy, that's another religious war that I'm not going to get into at the moment. It depends on what the rest of your database is doing. If you are storing everything in in a blob type database, then go for it. If you are doing things relationally, then you need to do whatever's going to match with the rest of your system. Okay, I heard, no wait, would you please explain the use case of YAML files in Kubernetes and Maven? Yeah, so basically in both of those places, YAML is used as definitions. So when you're telling YAML what you want, when you're telling Kubernetes what your pods are, or when you're telling Maven what you want to do and what all the values are, YAML is just the format that is used to specify that information. Okay, I've heard that we are not supposed to use tab spaces, but I've been using tab spaces in VS Code and it works well. Am I missing something here? You're not missing something. It's just that VS Code is smart enough to take that tab as an indication that you want to put in spaces as opposed to actually putting in a tab. So no, you're not missing something there. How much time should we give to learn YAML? It shouldn't take you that long, honestly. Once you know the basics, you are really pretty much good to start using it and learning the rest kind of as you go. So I wouldn't spend a ton of time. Can you please give me the most simple way to write a YAML file for a pod and deployment in Kubernetes? Also, if you can please share with me the PDF of the presentation, and thanks a lot. Okay, so the PDF of the presentation you're going to get, and I'm going to put you off on pods and deployments because that's going to be in part 2. However, I will tell you that there is an article on the Mirantis blog, Mirantis Kubernetes YAML deployment. There is an article, Intro to YAML, Kubernetes deployment examples, that will show you exactly that. It's an introduction to YAML that tells you a lot of the same things that I've told you today, but it uses pods and deployments as the example. So you can go there and grab that, or, and I say this with a wink, wink, sign up for part 2. You will be getting an invitation for part 2, and that will show you how all of that works. Is there any option available for passing parameters to a YAML file to read data from another file directly or by directly passing values? Not within YAML itself that I am aware of. But there is a way to define an object and then use that definition later. So for example, let me see if I can find a good example. I'll just make a good example. So for example, address street 1, 2, 3, 4, main, city, and state, Ohio. So let's call this billing address, And then if I wanted to do this, I could say ampersand address. Okay, that's not what I wanted. Ampersand address. And then I could say shipping address is the same as address. Okay, so what this does is it basically takes this object and drops it in here as the shipping address. So I could do that. But as far as passing in things, not really. That's going to be done through your application. I got 4 minutes left, and I've got so many questions. Let me see. Can you please show the VS Code extensions you recommend? No, I can't because I don't know how. All I know is I opened up a YAML file and VS Code said, oh, there's an extension for that. And I said, oh, give me that. So there you go. What if you omit ampersand and pipe in the previous question? What is the default behavior for multi-line values? So the default behavior for multi-line values is that they're not really a multi-line value. Okay, so if I were to say, okay, if I were to do that, let's just get rid of this. Okay, so there's no pipe there, no nothing. So if I then went and ran this, okay, it would just be, well, it would be a string. Well, son of a gun. Well, I stand corrected. So I guess that the greater than is going to be your default. See what happens? See, now if you have any questions, just go ahead and run it. You're not going to break anything. Can key and values in YAML be put in quotes like JSON? So, well, you know, I thought I knew the answer, but let's make sure. Well, I know the values can. Can the keys? Let's find out. I believe that they can, but let's check. Yes, they can. So there you go. Lost my screen. Will YAML be replaced in the near future with another thing? Is it worth it to learn it in 2021? Probably yes and yes. YAML will probably be replaced because everything is always replaced. But YAML is so deeply embedded in so many things that it's absolutely worth it to learn it. And it's really not that complicated. So the nice thing about YAML is you can see, I mean, if you have any questions, you can just mess around with it, you know, like we just did. You're not going to hurt anything. You're not going to break anything. It's pretty simple. And once you understand the basics behind it, you can start using it in your projects, and you will learn on the job, and you'll get to be pretty familiar with it and how it works. All right, so that brings us to just about the end here. Perfect timing. I think that was the last question. So I want to invite all of you. You're going to be getting, you'll be getting an invitation to part 2. I would like to invite you all to please come. And I want to thank you for coming today. This has been terrific. You've had some really great questions. I know everybody's really busy and sick of staring at their computers. So thank you for joining us here today. And we will see you next time. Thanks a lot.